What the mountain guide Vasari told us before we entered the Bela Pass, and the fact that Commander Heilig laughed at him, is the part I have returned to most often in the months since. Vasari told us that the thing living above the second ridge would know we were there before we cleared the first tree line, that it would follow us from the moment we entered, and that men who came to measure the land and mark it as belonging to someone else were not among those it permitted to pass through. He said all of this without dramatics, in the same flat register he used to describe water sources and terrain grades. Commander Heilig said Vasari was a superstitious peasant, and Vasari said nothing further, and we entered the pass on the morning of the 14th of October, 1743, with 11 men, and what I now understand to have been no real chance of completing our survey. My name is Johann Krieger. I served as Deputy Surveyor for the Imperial Geographic Commission under Commander Franz Heilig, and I am giving this testimony under oath to this administrative inquest on the 22nd of March, 1744, 5 months and 8 days after the events I am about to describe. I am 34 years of age. I have spent 12 years conducting land surveys in conditions that require precision and patience, and I have always placed my confidence in what I can measure and record. I am not a man who deals in impressions or interpretations when numbers are available. What I am about to give you is a measured account, to the extent that measurement was possible in the circumstances. Where measurement failed me, I will say so. I am not here to convince you of anything beyond what I witnessed. What those measurements mean, I will leave entirely to this body. The commission had been authorized in the summer of that year by the Imperial administration at Vienna. The stated purpose was to chart viable overland routes through the inner Carpathian passes northeast of Bratislava, specifically to assess paths capable of handling trade wagon transit between the upper highland valleys and the eastern lowland markets, which had been relying on seasonal river routes that flooded unpredictably and cost merchants considerable delays. The overland option had been discussed for decades, but no serious cartographic effort had been made in the relevant territory, largely because the interior passes were considered difficult and the local population was sparse and unreliable as a source of geographic information. Commander Heilig had been selected for this commission on the basis of his previous survey work in the lower Austrian highlands. I was assigned as his second because of my experience with alpine triangulation methods and my record of accurate baseline measurements in irregular terrain. We assembled at Bratislava in the last week of September with a team of 11 men. Beyond Heilig and myself, our party included August Brandt, the lead cartographer, who was perhaps the most technically accomplished man I have worked with in my career, precise and thorough, and completely devoted to his craft. There were 4 laborers, the brothers Anton and Wilhelm Linzer, a broad-shouldered Moravian named Sedlak, and a sharp-eyed man from the Styrian lowlands named Fuchs, who had worked survey camps before and knew the routine well. Our cook was a heavy-set Viennese named Moser, whose food was unremarkable but consistent, and who managed camp logistics with a competence that was easy to overlook until you needed it. Our military escorts were 2 soldiers named Kern and Tausig, both experienced men, calm in their manner and efficient in their duties, assigned by the military district at the commission's request, and our guide was Vasari. Vasari had been recommended by the regional prefect as the only man in the province who knew the interior Carpathian passes well enough to be trusted as a guide. He was perhaps 50 years old, compact, with a face that had absorbed a great deal of weather. He spoke German haltingly and Slovak fluently, and what I later learned was a dialect of Ruthenian that no one else in our party understood. He was quiet by disposition and specific in his speech, and in the first days of our march toward the mountains he was helpful and informative, identifying water sources, indicating stable ground for camp placement, correcting Heilig's initial route assumptions, with a quiet authority that Heilig found irritating and I found reliable. It was Vasari who first told us to pay attention to the birds. This was the 4th day of our march, and it was the first indication that he was bringing information to this assignment that he had not been asked to bring. We were approaching the lower entry of the Bela Pass on the afternoon of the 4th day when Vasari stopped the column and stood listening. There was birdsong behind us, in the forest to our east, through which we had been walking for several hours. There was no birdsong ahead of us, in the forest to our west, which was the direction we were heading and which looked, from where we stood, identical to the forest we had come through. Vasari held up his hand for quiet, and we stood still in the cold October afternoon, listening to the difference between the two sides of where we were, which was the difference between sound and silence. And then he turned to Heilig and said that we should make camp here tonight and enter the pass in the morning, when the birds had had time to determine whether the path was clear. Heilig said we were not going to make camp at midday over the silence of birds, and Vasari said that the silence was not natural, that it did not have the quality of ordinary quiet, but of a quiet that had been imposed, and that he had heard this silence before, in this part of the mountains, and knew what it indicated. He did not elaborate on what it indicated. Heilig gave the order to continue, and we continued. I want to be precise about why I am including this moment in my testimony. I am not including it to argue that we were warned and should have heeded the warning. I am including it because it is part of the sequence of events as they happened, and because this inquest has asked me for a complete account, and because the silence Vasari identified was the first measurable anomaly I encountered in the Bela Pass, and I want the record to reflect that I was aware of it. I noted it in my field book that afternoon as acoustically unusual. I attributed it at the time to the specific characteristics of the terrain in the pass approach and the particular density of the old-growth forest. I no longer attribute it that way, but that is what I recorded then. We entered the Bela Pass on the morning of October 15th and spent that full day conducting initial survey work. The pass itself was perhaps 600 meters wide, at its broadest and narrowed progressively as it climbed northeast, reaching approximately 120 meters at the first natural throat, where a fast-running stream cut along the southern wall between two granite formations that Brandt marked immediately as useful fixed landmarks for the map base. The forest on either side of the valley floor was dense old-growth pine, trees of very considerable girth, their lower trunks bare of branches for the first 10 meters or more, which produced a particular quality in the available light, as though the floor of the forest were a long pillared hall, extending in every direction into dim distances. Vasari told us the pines in this section of the mountains were centuries old in many cases. I believed him. They had the look of things that had never needed anyone to believe in them. That first night in the pass was unremarkable. We made camp against the southern wall, with the stream providing fresh water nearby, and the granite formations providing some shelter from the northwestern wind that moved through the valley after dark. Moser prepared a meal of salt pork and dried bread that was eaten with the appetite of men who had been walking at altitude all day. The escort soldiers Kern and Tausig built the fire high and set a watch rotation. The laborers slept heavily. Brandt worked on his preliminary map sheets by firelight until Heilig told him to rest. I wrote up my field notes for the day and lay down under my blanket and listened to the fire crack and the stream run and the wind cross the ridge above us in long, sustained drafts, and I slept without interruption. The second day took us deeper into the pass, perhaps 3 kilometers past our first camp. The valley floor became rougher, with accumulated talus in several sections that required careful navigation for the equipment, and the walls grew progressively higher and closer, reducing our sky to a narrowing gray strip above the pine tops. We documented 2 secondary routes, one branching north and one south from the main valley floor, both too narrow for wagons but potentially suitable for pack animals or foot traffic, and Brandt recorded them with his usual care. The forest on either side was thicker here than it had been at the approach, and the ground between the trunk columns was carpeted in fallen needles so deep, in places 30 centimeters or more, that our footsteps were almost completely absorbed. The resulting silence when we stopped to work was of a quality I noted in my field records as unusual, not peaceful, something else, something with a texture to it, as though the silence were itself a substance that the trees had been producing for a very long time. Vasari was quieter than he had been during the march days. He answered questions when asked and guided us competently, But he did not volunteer observations, and twice during that afternoon I saw him turn and study the route we had come through, the columns of pine behind us receding into shadow, as though he were reading something in the arrangement of the trees that I did not have the vocabulary to read. When I asked him the second time what he was looking at, he said he was checking the light. The light behind us was the same grey diffusion as the light ahead of us, so I accepted his answer and added a note to my field record about his behavior, not because I understood its significance, but because the field record was supposed to be complete. The third day produced the first evidence I will describe for the record. We had moved another 1.5 kilometers into the pass interior and were establishing a survey station at a natural widening in the valley floor that our preliminary mapping had identified as a potential way station for trade caravans. Brandt was setting up his equipment on a flat outcropping when the laborer Fuchs, who had gone to fill our water containers at a tributary stream that ran from the northern slope, came back without the water. He came back with a particular expression that I recognized as the expression of a man who has seen something he was not expecting and has not yet organized his response to it. I asked him what was the matter. He said there were marks on the trees along the tributary path. He said they were at a height that did not seem right. I went with Fuchs to look at the marks, and without being asked, Vasari came with us. The tributary path wound approximately 40 meters from our workstation to the stream through a section of particularly large pines. On 3 of those trees on the uphill side facing the slope, there were parallel scoring marks in the bark. They were 3 to 4 centimeters in depth, cutting cleanly through the outer bark and into the pale wood beneath, made by something with the strength and firmness of grip to drive several centimeters into old timber. The marks ran in groups of 4 or 5 parallel lines, the kind of pattern consistent with claws, and they were positioned on the trunk at a height that I measured immediately and recorded, approximately 250 centimeters from the ground, 2.5 meters. I measured all 3 trees. The marks on each were between 245 and 252 centimeters from the ground. I recorded each measurement individually. I have those numbers in my field book, which I am prepared to surrender to this body. The significance of the height is what I want the record to understand. A bear, which would be the most defensible natural explanation for scoring of this type in a mountain forest, makes such marks at a height consistent with its ability to rear and reach. The highest bear scoring I have personally documented in the field was 187 centimeters from the ground, and that was an exceptionally large individual. Most bear scoring I have measured in alpine terrain falls between 140 and 170 centimeters. For a mark to appear at 250 centimeters, an animal would need to be significantly larger than any bear I have encountered in the literature, or it would need to have been standing in a posture that bears do not habitually adopt when marking territory, or it would not be a bear. I showed the measurements to Commander Heilig when we returned to the workstation. He reviewed them, handed my field book back to me, and said that exceptional individual animals exist in all species, that I was a surveyor and not a naturalist, and that we should return to the day's measurements and not alarm the men by presenting uncertain data as evidence of something definitive. I recorded his response in my notes. Vasari had stood looking at the marks on each tree for a period of time I estimated at 2 to 3 minutes per tree, and when I asked him what he thought had made them, he said he did not know the correct German word, and then said the thing was very old, and then walked back toward the workstation without further comment. That was the afternoon of October 17th. The 4th night was when the knocking began. I want to describe this inquest with the same precision I bring to measurements in the field, because I understand that the precision of this account is what will determine how it is received, and I intend it to be received accurately. We were camped at the valley widening, in a position Vasari had approved, with the fire built between 2 large boulders that broke the wind. The night was cold and clear, with a partial moon that lit the upper sections of the valley walls, while leaving the pine forest on both slopes in shadow. I had been asleep for some time when I woke to a sound. The sound was a knock, a single, solid, Percussive knock, the kind of sound produced by a dense object striking a large tree trunk with significant force. Not a crack or a snap. Not a branch moving in wind or falling. Not the sound an animal makes moving through underbrush or disturbing the canopy. A deliberate, contained, concussive knock, delivered once, and then silence. I lay still. I regulated my breathing. Several seconds elapsed. Then the knock came again, from the same direction, the same character, the same force. Then several more seconds of silence. Then a third knock. The intervals between the knocks were, I estimated, between 8 and 10 seconds. Consistent, not variable in the way that random sounds are variable, not shorter when the source was moving, or longer when it paused, but even maintained across the duration with the consistency of something intentional. I lay in my blanket and I counted the intervals, and I tell you that they were equal, and that equal intervals of that kind do not come from animals moving through trees, or wind acting on branches, or any other natural process I am aware of. The sound came from the western side of the valley, in the pine forest above the camp. At a distance I estimated at approximately 200 meters. I base this on my familiarity with how sound travels in enclosed mountain valleys, which I have documented in previous survey work. At 200 meters in those conditions, with the valley walls acting as resonant surfaces, the sound was audible, but not loud. Not loud in the way it would become. I sat up. Across the fire, I saw that Vasari was already sitting upright, already listening, his blanket folded back with the neatness of a man who had not been fully asleep. Our eyes met across the diminished fire. He gave me a single, slow nod, confirming that he heard the same thing, and then he looked back toward the western slope and said nothing. The knocking continued at its even intervals. I counted 41 individual knocks before it ceased, and the silence returned. I recorded the count in my field book. I recorded the direction and estimated distance. I recorded the interval as consistent, approximately 8 to 10 seconds throughout. I recorded the time of onset as approximately 2 in the morning by my estimate of the stars. And then the sound stopped, and eventually I slept again. In the morning I asked Vasari what had made the sound. He said the same thing that always made it. I asked him what he meant by that, and he said it meant the thing that marks trees and walks upright on 2 legs. And then he began breaking camp and declined to say anything further. I reported the sound to Commander Heilig. He said it was a woodpecker or a bough striking a trunk in the wind. I noted that there had been no wind that night and that woodpeckers do not operate at 2 in the morning. And he told me to record the measurements I had been hired to record and not to alarm the men with interpretations that exceeded my professional competence. I want the record to note that I accepted this response. Not because I found it persuasive, but because I was not yet in a position to argue against it with the kind of evidence that would hold up in a professional setting. I had a sound and an interval count. Those things, taken alone, were not enough. The 4th and 5th days of work in the pass interior were productive by survey standards. We documented the second narrowing of the valley, measured the grade of the central terrain, and identified a natural platform 15 meters above the valley floor on the northern wall that provided an excellent vantage point for triangulation work in the upper section. From this platform on the 5th day, with good conditions and the full use of Brandt's instruments, we were able to establish baseline measurements for the most complex section of the interior. Brandt was satisfied with the progress. His maps were taking shape. The work, looked at purely as work, was going well. The men, though quieter than they had been in the lower valley, were functioning competently. I noted in my field records that morale was adequate but subdued, and that the laborer Sedlak had taken to glancing at the tree line frequently when he thought no one was observing him. The 5th night, the knocking came again, and it came from the east. It was earlier in the night this time. I estimated midnight rather than 2 in the morning, and it came from the pine forest on the eastern slope above our camp. Same quality, same solid percussion. I lay awake and counted. I counted 63 knocks at intervals. I again estimated at 8 to 10 seconds, consistent throughout. After 63 knocks, silence. Here is what I want the record to understand. On the fourth night, the knocking came from the west. On the fifth night, it came from the east. We were camped between those two slopes. Whatever was producing the sound had moved around us during the day, passing to the other side of our camp, or there were two of them, one on each slope, taking alternating nights. Either interpretation concerned me. I recorded both in my field book. I could not determine which was correct from the available data, and I have never been in the practice of asserting conclusions from insufficient data. The morning of October 20th brought the first open confrontation within our party. The four laborers had been conferring among themselves in the evenings, which I had observed and noted without concern, as it was natural for workers in the same camp to talk. But on the morning of the 20th, the brothers Linzer came to Commander Heilig before breakfast and told him that they wished to return to the approach camp and wait there for the expedition to come back down. The elder brother, Anton, spoke for them both. He said that they had not agreed to work in conditions of this kind, and that they were invoking the clause in their contract that permitted withdrawal under conditions of reasonable hazard. Heilig told them that no clause of that kind existed in their contracts, which I believe was accurate, and that abandonment of the commission would result in forfeiture of their compensation and a formal complaint to the Craft Guild, which could affect their ability to obtain work in the province for some time. Anton Linzer looked at him with the expression of a man doing arithmetic, and then said that he would rather be poor and alive than contracted and not, and Heilig told him to consider carefully before making a decision he could not unmake. I stood some distance from this conversation, but close enough to hear it. What I observed was that the two remaining laborers, Fuchs and Sedlak, were watching from near the cook fire, and that their attention had the quality of men who were waiting to see which direction the current ran before deciding whether to swim. I believe that if Heilig had conceded to the Linzer brothers, he would have lost all four laborers within the hour. Vasari, who was seated near the fire, said nothing during the confrontation until it had nearly run its course, and then he said one sentence. He said that if the expedition turned back now and left the survey incomplete, the thing in the forest would probably be satisfied with that. He said it in a tone that was purely informational, not dramatic, not urgent. Heilig told him to be quiet. Vasari was quiet. The Linzer brothers remained because they could not afford the consequences Heilig described. I want to be explicit for the record that I considered this outcome a mistake. I said so privately to Heilig after the confrontation was resolved, and he told me that we were within 3 days of the second pass, that the survey data we had already collected was valuable and would be even more valuable if completed, and that capitulating to the fears of day laborers was not how expeditions were run. I said that I was not describing fears, but documented anomalies, and he said that anomalies did not constitute grounds for abandonment of a commission, and that was the end of the private conversation. I am aware that this testimony will be read by people who will wonder why I, as a professional in my own right, did not push harder against Heilig's decisions. I ask this body to consider the structure of the commission and the professional relationships involved. Heilig was the commander. The commission was his. The decision authority was explicitly his. I had raised concerns and been overruled. The available evidence at that point, marks on trees, sounds in the night, laborers who wanted to leave, was not the kind of evidence that, in a professional setting, would have supported a formal override of a commander's judgment. I continued. I should perhaps have done otherwise. That is a question I will be asking myself for a long time. On the 21st of October, in the early afternoon, Fuchs found the bone disc. He was clearing a section of rock debris from a flat area we intended to use as a measurement station, moving the larger pieces by hand and the smaller ones with a flat shovel, when his shovel struck something that made a different sound than rock, harder and cleaner, at a depth of approximately 20 centimeters below the accumulated debris. He called me over. I came, and Vasari came with me without being asked. We cleared the debris from around the object with care. What emerged was a disc of carved bone, approximately 12 centimeters in diameter and 3 centimeters in thickness, cut from what appeared to be a large load-bearing bone of an animal I could not identify. Both faces of the disc were carved with markings, concentric circles interrupted by angular notations, lines that ran at deliberate angles, shapes that repeated with the regularity of a designed system rather than random ornament. The outer edge of the disc was smooth with wear, worn by handling across a long period. 2 holes had been drilled at the top of the disc, through which a length of braided cord still passed, the cord dark with age and very dry but not friable. The object could have been worn around the neck, or hung from a post or a branch. I examined it with the attention I bring to objects that have evidential value. The carving was precise. The concentric circles were regular. The angular marks were repeated in a pattern. Someone had made this with deliberate skill and had buried it in this location, or had left it here and allowed debris to accumulate over it across time. I could not date it in the field, but I have some experience with the aging of bone objects from previous work near archaeological sites, and I estimated this disc as decades old at minimum, and quite possibly much older. I showed it to Vasari. He held it in both hands for a long time, turning it slowly, examining both faces. Then he said that the marks were a warning to the creature, not to the men, and that someone who had been in this forest before us had left it as a form of negotiation, an acknowledgement that the territory was the creature's, and an offer of something in exchange for passage. I asked him what kind of thing a person could offer a creature in exchange for passage. He said the marks specified what was being offered, but that he could not read the marks because they were not in any language he knew directly, only in a tradition he had heard of that preceded the church and possibly preceded the settlements, and that he believed the marks were very old. I asked him whether the disc was still in force, whether its offer still held. He said that if the person who had left it was gone, either the offer had been accepted or it had not, and we were about to find out which. He returned the disc to me. I kept it. I have it here today, and will surrender it to this body if required. When I showed it to Commander Heilig, he told me it was a shepherd's marker, used by men grazing animals in the high passes to mark territory among themselves, and that I should throw it away rather than add unnecessary weight to our equipment cache. I did not throw it away. I want to be transparent with this body about why I kept it. Not because I believed at that point with certainty that it was what Vasari said it was, but because it was an artifact of evident age and deliberate craftsmanship recovered from a location with no obvious explanation for its burial, and discarding evidence that you cannot interpret is not the behavior of a rigorous observer. I kept it because it deserved to be kept. I keep things. It is part of my professional disposition. I am glad I kept it. The disc is in my bag at this moment, and any member of this body who wishes to examine it is welcome to do so after I finish speaking. The night of October 21st was when the sound became something I could not ascribe to any category of normal occurrence. The knocking began again, but it began from both sides simultaneously. I was awake when it started, which was sometime near midnight by my estimation. The sound from the western slope and the sound from the eastern slope began at approximately the same moment, each maintaining the same interval as on previous nights, each producing the same solid percussion, but now both at once, in a coordination that meant either that 2 separate sources were operating together, or that a single source was moving with a speed between the slopes that was not possible for anything moving through that terrain in the dark. I lay and I listened, and I tried to establish from the sound alone which of these explanations was accurate, and I could not. I counted both sounds. They were synchronized, or near enough to synchronized, that I could not detect a difference. This lasted for approximately 20 minutes. I know it lasted that long because I counted it. Then it stopped. In the silence that followed, I became aware that several of the other men were awake, because the particular quality of someone pretending to sleep is different from the quality of someone actually asleep, and the camp had a number of people who were very much awake and not moving. No one spoke. Moser made coffee over the coals without being asked, when it became clear that sleep was finished for the night, and we sat around the rebuilt fire until daylight, without conversation. The military escort Tausig came to me that morning while the others were breaking camp, and told me, in a low voice, that he had served on the northern frontier for 11 years during the previous decade, and that in that time he had heard accounts from local people, Ruthenian and Slovak communities in the mountain zones, of things that lived in the high passes that were older than any of the settlements, and that he believed from what we were experiencing that we were in the presence of one of those things, and that his professional assessment, as a man who had spent his career evaluating terrain and threat, was that we should leave. He said this plainly, without inflection, in the voice of a man filing a report. I brought his assessment to Heilig. Heilig said that a soldier who had spent 11 years on a peaceful frontier posting was not a reliable authority on wilderness threat assessment, and that his account of local folk stories was not germane to the operational situation. He said we would continue in the morning. The morning of October 22nd brought a finding that changed the atmosphere of the party in a way that Heilig's authority could not correct. We had placed a line of baseline survey stakes along the valley floor on the 20th, 12 stakes at measured intervals, serving as fixed reference points for the triangulation work we were conducting above. When Brandt went in the early morning to check the alignment of these stakes before beginning the day's measurements, he did not find them as we had left them. 3 of the stakes had been pulled from the ground and laid parallel to the valley floor, side by side, at a location approximately 60 meters from where they had been set. They were not broken. The ground from which they had been drawn showed the disturbance of stakes pulled vertically upward, the earth compressed at the edges of each hole from which the stake had been extracted. They had been arranged with a deliberateness that was impossible to explain as the result of weather or animal activity. Brandt came to get me. I went to look. And at the base of the southern valley wall, in the mud at the edge of the stream bank, I found the print. A single clear impression, partially overlapping with a second partial impression, in the soft, waterlogged mud of the bank. I measured the primary impression immediately, and recorded it before the morning activity in the stream could disturb the bank further. Length, 31 centimeters. Width at the broadest point, across the forward section, 14 centimeters. 5 distinct digit impressions, the largest on the inner side of the foot, graduated in size toward the outer edge, in the configuration that is consistent with a foot designed for bipedal weight-bearing. Depth at the heel, approximately 4 centimeters in soft mud, indicating a weight considerably in excess of any man in our party. The stride distance between the primary impression and the next point of disturbance in the soft earth, which was not a clean print, but a scuff suggesting the forward pad of a foot at the beginning of the next stride, was approximately 180 centimeters. I measured the scuff as well and recorded it. I found 2 additional faint impressions within a 3-meter radius, both too degraded by the overnight stream activity to yield precise measurements, but consistent in their general shape with the primary print. I will state for the record, with full professional confidence, these were not bear tracks. Bear tracks have a distinctive flat-soled plantigrade structure with claw impressions forward of the digit tips. These prints showed the forward loading of a foot that bore weight on the ball and heel in the pattern of a biped, with digit impressions showing no claw extension. They were structurally analogous to a very large human foot, elongated significantly beyond any human measurement, and they showed the depth impression of something carrying a weight far beyond a human's. I measured everything. I have every measurement. I showed them to Heilig. He said nothing for a period of approximately 3 minutes. He looked at the measurements, and he looked at the moved stakes, and he looked at the print, and then he said that we would complete the day's planned survey work and evaluate our position that evening. He did not say it was a bear. He did not say it was anything. He did not say the word woodpecker. I noted this change in his vocabulary in my field book. I want the record to understand what happened that evening, because it was the moment at which the choices made determined the subsequent events. We gathered around the fire after the day's work was complete, and Commander Heilig opened the question of whether to continue or to turn back. This was, I will note, the first time he had presented the question as open, and the fact that he presented it as open told every person at the fire what he was really asking, which was whether any of us would give him the argument he needed to change course, without having to reverse himself publicly. Heilig argued for continuing. He was measured and specific. He said we were 2 days from the second pass. He said the survey data we had collected was incomplete and therefore limited in its value to the Commission. He said that retreat on the basis of unusual sounds and modified survey equipment would be professionally indefensible and would likely result in the withdrawal of the Commission's authorization and the payment of a significant portion of the contracted fee. He said no member of the party had been harmed. He said that whatever was in this forest had, on every occasion, stopped short of direct contact with our group. He said he did not believe it would escalate beyond what we had so far experienced. He was wrong about that last point, but his argument was not unreasonable on its face, given what we knew at the time. Vasari spoke when Heilig was finished. He spoke calmly, with the same flat precision he brought to everything. He said that what Heilig described as a pattern of stopping short was in fact a system of escalation, and that the system worked in stages, beginning with observation, then physical evidence of presence, then physical evidence of capability, and that the next stage was direct contact, and that direct contact did not mean negotiation. He said that the bone discs we had found were a form of communication with this system, a way of acknowledging the stages before they progressed. He said we had not acknowledged anything, we had simply moved deeper into the territory. He said that the men who had left the discs had understood something that most men did not understand, which was that the thing in this forest had been here long enough to have developed an expectation of how encounters with humans would proceed, and that if you followed the expected form, it sometimes allowed passage, and that we were not following the expected form. Heilig asked him what the expected form was. Vasari said the expected form was to come in with permission, to take only what was needed, and to leave quickly. He said the expected form was also to acknowledge, through a gesture the creature understood, that you knew whose forest this was. Heilig said this was superstition dressed up as policy, and that he had no intention of leaving offerings for animals in the woods. Vasari looked at him for a moment and then said, "I did not say offerings, I said acknowledgement." There was a silence after that. The fire moved. Tausig looked at the dark tree line to the west, and then looked back at the fire. Kern, the other soldier, asked Vasari directly, "What is the creature? What does it look like?" Vasari thought about this for a moment, looking into the fire, and then he said, "It walks on 2 legs, and stands as tall as this fire is high." He gestured toward the top of the flames, which were perhaps 2.5 meters at their peak. He said it has the skull and the ears of a wolf, but the shoulders and the arms of something heavier than a wolf, and that it is covered in dark fur, and that it is very old, older than the settlements in the valleys below, and that it would still be in this forest when every person sitting at this fire tonight was gone from the world. He said it was called different things in different languages, and he had no particular preference for any of them. He said all of this without his voice rising or falling. Heilig said that this was exactly the variety of peasant mythology that educated men were specifically trained not to credit. He said it with more force than was warranted, which was the first indication I had seen that his confidence was genuinely shaken. Tausig said quietly, "I believe the guide, Commander." No one else said anything for a long time. Then Brandt, who had been sitting with his maps in his lap throughout the conversation, looked up and said that he thought Heilig was probably right, and that he wanted to finish the survey. He said it simply, with the tone of a man stating a professional preference. Heilig thanked him. The group went to sleep without a formal decision. The watches were set. Vasari rolled into his blanket with the efficiency of a man who had contributed what he had to contribute and could do nothing more. I lay awake for a long time. I made a decision in the dark that I did not speak aloud to anyone. I decided that if the following night brought anything more direct than sounds and moved equipment, I would advocate formally for retreat, and that if Heilig refused, I would leave regardless. I had a wife in Vienna. I had obligations. I had a life that extended beyond this commission, and I was not willing to be the next thing that was removed from a morning campsite without explanation. I told myself these things in the dark and believed them, and whether that belief was courage or self-preservation, I could not entirely determine. The morning of October 23rd produced excellent survey conditions, with clear skies and good light, and we worked through the day with a determination that I now understand as the determination of people who are avoiding an awareness they cannot do anything about. We completed the triangulation work from the northern platform. Brandt made measurements that he described as the best of the survey. The laborers worked without complaint. Vasari guided us to appropriate stations. Heilig was in good professional spirits, and I understood from his demeanor that he had interpreted the previous night's inconclusive debate as a decision to continue, and that he had organized himself around this interpretation. In the afternoon, Vasari found the second bone disc. He found it at the base of a pine tree on our route between survey stations, lifting it from where it lay against the root, as though he had known it was there, or had been looking for something of this kind. It was smaller than the first disc, approximately 8 centimeters in diameter, and the markings on both faces were more numerous and more densely arranged, covering the surfaces completely, in a way that suggested urgency, or elaboration, or both. The cord was newer than the cord on the first disc, in the relative sense of being less dark and less dry, though still clearly old. The disc itself showed the same signs of wear from handling. Someone had spent time with this object before leaving it here. I asked Vasari how old it was, and he said he could not determine that precisely, but that it was old. I asked if the markings were the same tradition as the first disc, and he said they were the same system. I asked him what this disc said, and he paused for a long time, turning it in his hands, and then said that it was a more specific contract than the first one. He said the first disc acknowledged the territory. He said this disc specified what had been removed from the territory, and listed what was being offered in return for the removal. I asked what was being offered. He said the marks described a promise to leave certain things unmeasured, to leave particular areas of the forest without survey marks, to take the knowledge of the route, but not to complete the record of it. I looked at him for a moment. I looked at Brandt's map case. And I understood, in that moment, what we had been doing in this forest, in terms that the creature in it might understand, which was different from the terms in which we understood it ourselves. We were completing a record. We were measuring dimensions and marking boundaries, and encoding the interior of the forest into a document that the Habsburg administration would use to route wagon traffic through it. We were, from the perspective of something that had been in these passes since before any administration existed, making a permanent claim to know and use a place that it had held without documentation for a very long time. I brought this framing to Heilig that evening. I said it plainly. I think the creature in this forest understands that we are mapping its territory, and I think that is what it objects to. Heilig looked at me for a moment, and then said that he could see that Vasari's storytelling was getting inside my professional thinking, and that a creature, whatever its nature, did not understand cartographic surveying, and that a map did not constitute a claim to territory in any sense that an animal could perceive. I said I was not sure the creature saw it that way. He said we were 2 days out, we would finish. The knocking that night began at sunset. Not at midnight, not in the small hours. At sunset, while the light was still in the upper valley walls, and the fire was barely started and Moser was preparing the evening meal, the sound came from the west, and it was close, far closer than it had been on any previous night. And I will tell this body honestly that I knew from the moment I heard it that the escalation Vasari had described had progressed to a new stage. The distance was less than 100 meters. I know this because at that range the sound was not merely audible but physically present, a vibration in the chest wall that accompanied each impact, a resonance that the previous night's knocking had not produced. The intervals were the same, 8 to 10 seconds, but the pacing seemed slower, more deliberate, as though whatever was producing the sound had chosen to reduce its tempo now that the distance no longer required it to project. There was something in that deliberateness that I could not explain by normal sound physics and could not eliminate from my awareness. Heilig ordered Kern to fire a warning shot into the forest, in the direction of the sound. Kern loaded his rifle and fired into the western tree line. The knocking stopped. 2 minutes of silence followed, or approximately 2 minutes. I counted. Then it resumed, closer than before and faster. Vasari stood from his position by the fire and said, quietly, "That was a mistake." Heilig told him to keep his interpretations to himself. The knocking did not stop that night. It did not come in episodes with intervals of silence, as it had on the previous nights. It maintained a continuous presence from sometime after sunset until after 3 in the morning, occasionally from the west, occasionally from the east, occasionally from both at once, shifting its position, growing incrementally closer by increments small enough that at any given moment I could argue it had not moved. But across the full duration of the night, it was clear that whatever was producing the sound was systematically reducing its distance from our camp. At the closest point, I estimated the source at 30 meters. At 30 meters in that enclosed valley, the sound was loud enough that I felt it in my back teeth. We did not sleep. All 11 of us were awake around the fire, which we kept as high as the wood supply allowed. No one spoke for most of the night. The laborers sat in a tight group. Kern kept his rifle across his knees but did not load it again. Tausig sat very still and looked at the tree line at regular intervals. Brandt held his map case in his lap. I wrote field notes for as long as I could see, and then sat with my hands on my knees and counted the intervals. Sometime before 4 in the morning, the knocking stopped. We waited. Nothing followed. The silence was complete. The dawn came grey and cold. We had been awake the entire night. Moser had coffee on the fire before the light was sufficient to work by, and we drank it in silence. Heilig did not announce the survey schedule for the day. No one asked for it. I believe every person at that fire understood that the morning's question was not what we would measure, but whether we would leave, and I believe most of us had already answered it for ourselves. Brandt was the one who said it. He set down his coffee cup, looked at Heilig across the fire, and said, simply, "Franz, we should go back today." Heilig looked at him for a long time. I watched Heilig's face, because Heilig's face was where the decision was happening. He was a competent professional man in middle age who had built his career on the value of completing his assignments, and the cost of turning back from this commission, professionally and financially, was not a small cost, and I could see him calculating it. He looked around the fire. He looked at the laborers, who were waiting. He looked at Tausig, who had already given his professional opinion. He looked at Vasari last, and Vasari looked back at him with the settled attention of someone who had been waiting for this moment and was ready to act on it regardless of what it produced. Heilig said, "We go back. Break camp." We moved with speed. I packed my instruments and my field books. I placed the 2 bone discs at the bottom of my pack and put the field books on top of them. I was packed in less than 10 minutes, which is faster than I normally achieve it, and I checked the fastenings and hoisted the pack. Around me, the other men were moving with similar urgency, each working in their own efficient silence, the camp coming down in the rapid, coordinated manner of people who understand that speed has value. I want to describe this moment accurately for the record, because it matters. Everything was nearly ready. Vasari had already started south along our route of descent. The laborers had their packs. Kern and Tausig were loaded. Moser had the camp pack. Heilig had his materials. And someone said Brandt's name. He was not in the camp. His equipment pack was on the ground. His map case was beside it, closed and buckled with the care he brought to everything. His instrument bag was gone. Brandt himself was not there. We called his name. We called it several times, in multiple directions, not loudly, because raising our voices felt like something we had decided against, without discussing it. His name went out into the gray morning, among the pine columns, and came back as all sounds came back in that forest, absorbed and returned in a form that carried no information. Fuchs moved toward the tributary path, the one where we had found the tree marks on the first day of the survey, and Vasari caught him by the arm firmly and said that no one would enter the forest. I told Vasari that Brant was a member of this expedition and that abandoning him was not something I was prepared to accept. Vasari said, with the same flat quiet he had maintained throughout, that the cost had been settled and that we should move. I looked at Heilig. Heilig's face showed me something I can only describe as a man performing a calculation he never wanted to perform and arriving at an answer he had never wanted to arrive at. He stood still for 45 seconds. I know because I counted. Then he said we would search for Brant for 10 minutes, in pairs, within the camp perimeter and the immediate surroundings, but no one would enter the forest. We searched for 10 minutes. We found nothing, not a footprint, not a dropped tool, not a mark in the pine needles showing which direction he had gone. August Brant, who had been there moments before, had simply ceased to be in the camp, and the camp had no record of his departure. We left his pack and his map case. We left. The retreat from the Bella Pass took the remainder of that day and all of the following one. I want to describe it for this body, with the same attention I have brought to everything else, because what happened during the retreat is as relevant as what happened during the survey. We moved south at a pace that was not quite a run, but was not what any of us would have called a walk under normal circumstances. Vasari led. I walked second. Behind me, the laborers and Moser moved in a close group, not spreading out as walkers normally do on open ground, staying within arm's reach of each other in the way that people do when what is around them is unknown. Kern and Tausig walked at the rear, each turning to face backward at regular intervals to scan the forest behind us. For the first hour, nothing. The forest was the same forest we had walked through on the way in. The pine columns, the needle floor, the gray overhead light. No sounds. No movement at the tree line. The knocking had stopped and had not resumed. We were simply 11 men, or 10, walking south through old pines. I am going to be exact about the next development. We were approximately 2 kilometers from our previous camp, moving through a section of the pass where the valley widened slightly and the trees were less dense, and I heard it. A single knock from the eastern slope, directly to our right. Then nothing. Then a knock from the west, behind us, and to the south. I did not stop walking. Vasari did not stop walking. He lengthened his stride marginally, and I matched him. The knocking continued. East, then west. East, then west. And then both at once, alternating at the original interval, and what I want to tell this body, clearly and without uncertainty, is that the sounds moved with us. I monitored their position carefully as we walked. When we were moving south, the sounds were south of our position, ahead of us and behind us, and to both sides. When we paused, they paused around us. The relative distance between our column and the sounds remained consistent across changes in our speed and direction. That is not the behavior of sounds with fixed sources. That is the behavior of sources that are tracking a moving object. I wrote in my field book while walking. I have the notes. I recorded the direction changes, the intervals, the estimated distances. The notes are not clean, because writing while walking on rocky ground in a state of controlled fear does not produce clean notes, but they are legible and they are accurate. We came out of the pine forest into a section of open scree slope, perhaps 300 meters of rocky terrain between two sections of forest that we had crossed on our ascent. When we reached the edge of the trees, Vasari stopped. I stopped beside him. The rest of the column came up behind us and slowed. The knocking had stopped the moment we stepped out of the tree line. The open slope was silent. We stood for a moment. I was breathing harder than the terrain warranted. And then, at the edge of the tree line behind us, at the margin between the pine shadow and the gray light of the open slope, I saw it. It was standing in the trees, not out on the open ground, not advancing toward us, but positioned at the very boundary of the forest, in the space where the last trunk stood before the slope began. It was upright. I want to be explicit on this point for the record. It was standing on two legs, in a vertical posture, and it was not crouching or transitioning between postures. It was standing, as a man stands, with the full weight of itself on 2 feet, and in that posture it reached a height I estimated at 2.5 meters. Its surface was dark, a dense, dark covering that was not flat like a painted surface, but had depth and texture, the depth and texture of fur. Its shoulders were very broad, broader than the shoulders of any man I have seen. Its arms were long, proportionally longer than a man's arms, and they hung at a slight angle from the body, in the resting posture of an animal that normally uses them for weight-bearing, but had chosen, in this moment, not to. And its head was not a man's head. The skull was elongated forward, the facial region projecting well beyond the orbital plane, and the ears were positioned high on the skull and came to a point, large and forward-facing, in the configuration of a canid, built to locate sound at distance. It was looking at us. The distance between where I stood and where it stood was approximately 50 meters. The light was gray and diffuse, but adequate. I could see it clearly. I could see the structure of the head. I could see the posture. I could see that it was still, completely still, with the stillness of something that does not need to move to demonstrate its presence. I do not know how long this lasted. I know that I was counting, because counting is what I do when I need to maintain my function, and I believe the count reached approximately 40 seconds before anything changed. During those 40 seconds, 11 men, or 10, stood on a rocky slope in the Carpathian mountains and looked at something looking back at them, and no one spoke and no one moved. Then it turned its head, slowly, to look at the forest behind it. Then it turned back to look at us. Then it stepped back, 1 step, 2 steps, and the shadow of the pines took it. It was gone. I remained where I was for perhaps 10 more seconds. Then Vasari said, quietly, "Move," and I moved, and everyone moved, and we did not look back at the tree line again. We crossed the scree slope and entered the lower section of the pass, where the trees were less dense, and the walls were lower, and the valley widened. The knocking did not resume. The afternoon passed in silence, the natural silence of a mountain forest in October, birds absent but wind present, and we descended toward the pass approach in the gray light of the late day, with the particular focus of people who have decided that what is behind them will stay behind them if they do not give it a reason to follow. We made the approach camp by late afternoon. Moser had a fire built before the light was entirely gone. We ate. Kern checked his rifle a number of times, out of what I recognized as the need to do something with his hands, and then set it down and did not check it again. Sedlak sat with his back against a boulder for the better part of 2 hours, looking at the fire with the focused blankness of a man who is not seeing what he is looking at. Eventually Kern put a hand on his shoulder, and he came back. We reached Bratislava in 4 days without further incident. I made my preliminary report to the regional prefect on the day we arrived and submitted my official documentation to the commission in the following week. My report stated that the survey had been interrupted by deteriorating field conditions and the loss of a member of the party, and that the interior passes could not be reliably rated for wagon transit based on the data collected. This was accurate in its facts. It was incomplete in its explanation. I did not include in the official report what I have included in this testimony, because I did not know how to include such things in an official document in a way that would serve anyone. I knew what it would look like. I knew what conclusion most readers would draw about the mental state of the person reporting it. That is why I agreed to give this testimony, because it deserves to exist in a record somewhere, because August Brandt was a real man who went into that forest and did not come out, and the account of what happened in that forest is incomplete without what I am telling you now. I want to say something about Brandt. He was the best cartographer I have worked with in my career. His maps were precise, and his standards were exacting, and he had a particular attention to the small features of terrain that made his work more reliable than most, the kind of small, honest care that most people do not notice, but that adds up over time into a body of work that matters. He was not a dramatic man. He was not prone to grand statements or strong feelings. He was a man who showed up and did his work well, and I have never known a better form of human character than that one. He deserved to finish his maps. He deserved to come home. I do not know what happened to him in that camp in the minutes before we left. I know that the camp showed no sign of what had taken him or where he had gone. I know that Vasari said the cost had been settled, and I have thought about what that means across the 5 months since that morning, and I do not have an interpretation of it that I am comfortable offering as professional testimony. What I can say is that we left him there, and that leaving him there was the price of the rest of us leaving it all, and that I carry that with me in the way that a man carries the things he cannot set down. The 2 bone discs are in my pack. My field books with all measurements are beside them. I am prepared to surrender everything to this body. I have given you the most complete and accurate account I am capable of producing. Everything in it is what I witnessed, measured, or heard. I have added nothing. I have excluded nothing that is germane. I hear the knocking still. At night, in Vienna, in my own house, when the house is quiet and there is nothing in the dark to hear. An even interval, 8 to 10 seconds, like a slow, deliberate count, like something measuring the distance between where it is and where I am. I do not know if this is memory. I do not know if there is a difference between memory of that kind and the thing itself. Some nights I think I know. Other nights I lie awake and count the intervals, and they are always the same, always even, always patient. And I think about the pines in those passes, how old they are, how still they were, and I think about what was moving between them on those nights, and I understand that I am one of the few people alive who has measured something that cannot be measured, and that the measurements I recorded are the most useless and the most important work of my career. That is my testimony. I am finished.